If you've had any exposure to popular opinions about the Bible, you've probably heard that it is filled with contradictions. Indeed, it would seem that the Bible is the poster boy for the sheer mind-staggering pile of contradictions. But have you actually ever investigated this for yourself? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. Sometime during my final year in high school, I heard that the Bible was loaded with contradictions. Words like hundreds or even thousands were used by some. Not knowing any better, my initial response was to accept what was said at face value. But at the age of 17, I was starting to think more critically, so I decided to find out for myself and go on a contradiction hunt in the Bible. I acquired a blank, coil-bound notebook thick enough to record all the contradictions I expected to find, and proceeded to carefully read through the entire Bible, writing down the contradictions as I encountered them. As I began to work my way through the months-long project, I was surprised at how few I found. Most of the contradictions that I recorded were resolved as I continued to read, coming across additional information in the broader context. By the time I finished the following year, I was shocked at how few remained, somewhere less than about a half a dozen for the entire Bible. About 15 years later, immediately after giving a talk on God and Christianity at the University of Calgary, a student handed me a computer printout of hundreds of contradictions in the Bible. Wow, I thought. This will be extremely helpful, and I eagerly looked forward to going through the massive list. My excitement, however, was replaced with disappointment as I started through the list. I didn't make it past the first page. Most, if not all of them, would have been resolved if the person making up the list had just read one or two additional verses, or had not simply cherry-picked a phrase completely out of context. There are some examples of apparent contradictions in the Bible, however, that are not a result of neglecting to actually read it, but are the result of reading it with a 21st century Western cultural mindset. In other words, we assume that the way we write today is the way the ancient Middle Eastern person wrote 2,000 years ago or more. As a result, our own assumptions are what produce apparent contradictions. I use the word apparent to suggest that they only appear to be contradictions when, in fact, they are not. So let's take a look at 4 mistakes modern people make when reading ancient Middle Eastern literature. They include assuming chronology, word-for-word quoting, assuming every account is a complete account, and that each account does not span a prolonged period of time. So with that in mind, let's look at the first one, assuming chronology. One of my all-time favorite authors is George MacDonald. If you were to ask me to tell you about him, I might mention a few historical facts, such as when and where he lived, but most of what I told you would center around his ideas, his literary skill, and the different books that he wrote. I would have little interest in describing those things in chronological order. More likely, I would talk about these things in order of their importance, or according to how much I enjoyed them. If you asked me for what I thought were his 5 best books, the order in which he wrote them would have little or no importance for me, but the ranking in terms of enjoyment would determine the order. It is his ideas and the way he described them that is important to me. This non-chronological approach was even more common in ancient Middle Eastern writings. In fact, the general rule you should follow when reading these ancient writings, including the Bible, is this: never assume chronology unless it is explicitly stated. So when you read the gospel accounts of the life of Christ, you will sometimes observe that some events occur in a different order in different gospels. To the Western mind, this is a contradiction. But to the ancient writer, there was no reason to talk about events in chronological order unless he had a purpose for it. Another mistake that we often make is assuming precise quotes. I learned many years ago that when giving a public lecture, I must take great care to give the exact letter-for-letter wording if I was quoting someone, or else someone in the audience might accuse me of misrepresenting the person I quoted. This is an expectation of the Western mind. Not so the ancient Middle Eastern writer. As a result, a 21st century reader will see quotes where the exact wording varies as a contradiction, but they would be mistaken. An important aspect in understanding the Bible is to try to understand how the original audience would have understood it. For the ancient Middle Eastern writer, it was important to accurately communicate what the person meant. The exact wording was not important. So you may read 2 or 3 different people quoting someone else in the Bible and notice that each one used their own wording rather than the exact original wording. This can actually be very helpful. Have you ever heard a single sentence and knew that it could be taken more than one way and wondered what exactly it meant? Hearing or seeing a quote described 2 or 3 different ways helps us understand what the person meant when they said it. It clarifies their intention. A notable type of quote, which was often employed in these ancient writings, was to summarize a more lengthy series of statements, sometimes made over an extended period of time, into just one quote. The objective was to give an accurate, concise summary of an overarching point. Another mistake we make here in the 21st century when we read ancient text is assuming completeness. One supposed contradiction in the Bible that has often been pointed out is the discrepancy over how many angels were at the tomb the morning when the women visited it. One gospel mentions 2 angels. Another gospel only mentions the one that was doing the talking. Some people see this as a contradiction between the 2 accounts, but that assumes the objective of each account was the same, and it was to give a complete summary of the facts. When an ancient Middle Eastern writer was describing some particular event, they would often just include the facts that were important for their main point. Other facts, not relevant for their purposes, would be left out. A different writer might include some overlapping facts, but also some additional facts if they had a different point they wished to make. The modern Western mind assumes that there's a contradiction, when in fact we are just observing the event from 2 slightly different perspectives, each of which only gives the facts relevant to their different perspectives. I witnessed another example of this in a YouTube discussion between well-known atheist Bart Ehrman and Christian lecturer Peter J. Williams of Cambridge University. Ehrman pointed out what he thinks is a contradiction in the Bible between 2 different descriptions of how Judas, the betrayer of Christ, died. In one account, he fell headfirst, burst open, and all his intestines gushed out. Clearly, we're missing some information here because a person does not simply trip and fall and burst open with such force. The other account states that he went out and hung himself. At first, it appears to be a contradiction until one realizes that the other account might actually provide that missing information if Judas hung himself outdoors from a tree that was growing out over the edge of a cliff. The bottom line is this: when reading ancient Middle Eastern writers, never assume that a description of an event is a complete list of all the facts. Only those facts relevant to the writer's goals or perspective will be included. The last mistake we tend to make in the 21st century when reading ancient Middle Eastern texts is to assume that when we read a description of a series of events, that they all happened right after one another. For example, I've been asked if all the trees growing on my lot here were already here when I bought it. My response is that after buying the lot where I built my house, I planted those trees. I could add that it was about 5 years later after buying the lot, but my goal is not to give a detailed history of how the trees got there. I'm just answering the question of whether or not I planted them or not. When that happened is not the issue. We can call this the telescoping of events that occurs when one talks about events that were quite spread out in time, but included in one single summary account. The telescoping of events is very common in the Bible. In some cases, it speaks of current events as well as events that occur at the end of human history, all in the same passage without mentioning any interval of time. Other passages might more clearly indicate that there is an interval of time between those events. A modern reader assumes that events that are described one after another happened immediately together or very close together would be making an unwarranted assumption that might be wrong. My point is that once we become aware that the telescoping of events was normal in ancient Middle Eastern writings, where the objective was not to provide a detailed history, but rather to give the reader a summary, then a lot of apparent contradictions disappear. In conclusion, there are three different types of apparent contradictions, that is, statements that appear to be contradictions but are in fact not. A significant number of them arise when we take into account our 21st century Western assumptions and apply them to ancient Middle Eastern writings. When we recognize our assumptions and learn not to apply them to ancient writings, then a lot of those issues are cleared up, and we are then able to get a more accurate understanding of what the writers were trying to communicate. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.